Local programming on KRWG made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Fronteras at Changing America. I'm Anthony Moreno. Our guest today is part of a group of contributors who have come together in a book that takes a look back at our country's historical race to space through the now abandoned places that once captured the world's attention as rockets launched into space, moving our nation's space program into the future. Our guest today is Dr. Beth OLeary. She is a former NMSU professor who contributed to the book Abandoned in Place, Preserving America's Space History. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Now, it's really interesting because when you were telling me about your work with this project, it all started from a student project, is that correct? Or a class?
Yes, and you know, any great research starts with a great question. So in 1999, Ralph Gibson, who was a graduate student in my cultural resource management class here at NMSU, asked me a question: does federal preservation law apply on the moon? And I had no idea. So that started this saga, and we wrote to NASA. We were funded here on campus by the New Mexico Space Grant Consortium. Pat Hines believed that a humanities scholar could get money to travel and research first what was on the moon, and second, does federal preservation law cover it?
Okay, so now tell me a little bit about this whole process of how you started with just that question, you got the funding, and then it's been obviously many, many years since that first question was proposed. And tell me a little bit more about how that is looking right now. What is the work, the end result really?
Well, the end result is I think NASA has become aware of all the incredible assets, all the artifacts, not just what they would consider junk or leftover stuff, on the moon. So we started really as a surprise to them. We asked them, you know, can we nominate this site? And we focused on Apollo 11. That's the first lunar landing site on the moon, as the most iconic. We realized there is probably in excess of 190 metric tons of cultural material on the moon today. Wow. By United States and other countries. But we decided to focus on Apollo 11. And in the beginning, they were like, well, we're not that interested in it. We don't have jurisdiction. It would be a claim of sovereignty. But by 2011, I was invited with a group of other scientists, and Roger Lonnie is from the Smithsonian, to help write the guidelines for spacefaring nations who are going to go back to the moon. So that's a sea change from starting out with a student question to what happens now.
So, I mean, it makes me think, I mean, we have to look at this whole experience as space archaeology.
That's right, and I think that Ralph started the field with that question. I've been working with people from Australia, from Canada, from England about why we need to preserve now our space exploration, the artifacts, the sites. It's a period in our history. It's not very old, it's only about 50 years old, but we need to think about how to preserve stuff for future generations. I'm older than you. I remember when they landed on the moon. We have the images, we have documentation, but those artifacts are still there in place on the moon. And the facilities that put them there, the people that worked on it, in excess of 60,000 people got those three guys up there.
I mean, when we think about these historic space moments, we obviously think of the Apollo 11, the landing on the moon, walking on the moon, also the historic launches that have happened. But I guess we don't really think about what goes into just one launch and how much, you know, the Army, the Air Force, and NASA has really put into it. So, I mean, what are some of those things that, you know, like you mentioned a little bit earlier, and maybe you could go on a little bit more about that we could really see in this book that are contributed to the space race and exploration?
Well, here in New Mexico, we have many sites that contributed to the launch, beginning with the Roswell site, which Robert Goddard created to test the first rockets. We also have White Sands Missile Range, where Wernher von Braun and his team came over after World War II and essentially created the America's Missile Project. And it is the V-2 and its descendants that launched those guys to the moon. We also have Holloman Air Force Base, where the fastest man in the world, Colonel John Stapp, rode a very high-speed test track in a rocket sled. So New Mexico has a particular, we also have Ham, the chimpanzee, who was the first chimpanzee in space, who was trained at Holloman. So New Mexico has a particular relationship to the space age, and I find that very important. And the books in Abandoned in Place, the pictures in Abandoned in Place, really show some of those sites in New Mexico and at Cape Canaveral and other areas.
Now, I know one of the things we have here in southern New Mexico is a great resource, and that's the Space Museum that we have in Alamogordo, and that also has a connection to the work that you have done. Could you share with us what that was?
Right. Well, in 2003, I had a group of students, again, that were interested in this field, and we asked the director, Mark Santiago, at the time, if we could use the New Mexico Museum of Space History in Alamogordo as an anchor point, a site in New Mexico that we could link to the coordinates on the moon for the Apollo 11 lunar landing site. And he said yes. And so now we have a plaque there, and in the New Mexico database for archaeological resources, which the state of New Mexico keeps, we are LA 2 million. We are the Laboratory of Anthropology 2 million site, which is that first site on the moon. And so that's the first registered space site in space archaeology.
I wonder if the New Mexico Tourism Board is thinking about using that in any ways.
Well, let's hope so. I know the plaque is still up there, and they invited me to speak several times. So it's a great resource here in New Mexico. And the last time I was there to take a picture of one of the rocket sleds, there were several tourists who were looking around. So.
Interesting. Well, let's talk about this book, Roland Miller's Abandoned in Place. Obviously, it's one of those things that we look at a lot of these things. We get not only a history and some perspective, but we also get like an up-close view of a lot of these places, these launch sites, the behind-the-scenes work that really had to be done in order for folks to actually see the launch take place in the first place. But the way that Mr. Miller captures this is, I look at these photos in this book, and it almost seems as if they're works of art.
Well, I think what he's done is artistically and aesthetically document the space age. And some of the sites that were created to get those guys to the moon are monumental. You know, they're huge structures. There's many thousand tons of concrete and gantries and rocket stuff. So he has visually given us a portrait of what the space age looks like. And as an archaeologist, I'm interested in the material remains. I'm interested in these places. And it is these places that tell the story of our first exploit off the Earth, which is really an extraordinary journey. You know, we love firsts. We love the first people out of Africa, the first Europeans to the New World. And this is the first time humanity has stepped off the Earth.
I mean, one of the things that you notice in this book is that a lot of these places that were the spot of many first times are really, getting worn down. Time, weather, everything has really made an impact on these things. And, they may have the historical marker, but the preservation work and, the constant upkeep that may be needed so that future generations can understand this doesn't really exist in many of them. So I guess, is it great, something about this book that is able to really capture that, because some of these things may or may not be around in the future?
Well, when he wrote the book and took these pictures, and he took it over several decades, half of them are gone now. Okay, so it's a real plea, it's a real advocacy for preserving the space age and preserving the material culture of the space age. And I think he's done it in a way that makes us a little sad. It's very poignant, and the places look like ruins from another era, not 50 years ago, but from thousands of years ago. And so I think he's an advocate for space archaeology and heritage, to make people aware. And that's really what the whole purpose of space archaeology is to raise awareness that we need to document and we need to preserve not everything, that's impossible, but very important sites here on Earth that contributed to us leaving the Earth.
I mean, obviously, it kind of, when I first hear that, it sounds like it's a daunting task, you know? I mean, obviously, it's going to cost millions of dollars if you want to have this upkeep going on by an agency or something, but what, through your research, through talking with people in the field, what are some things that could possibly be done right now in order to ensure that many of these spots can continue to be preserved?
Well, they are being preserved by being repurposed in many cases. I was out at White Sands Missile Range and working with their archaeologists, and there's a vehicle assembly building. It's Launch Complex 33. That's where the Little Joe took off, and that tested the escape system for the astronauts if they had to escape from the rocket. It's repurposed for NASA's sounding rockets, but the bones and the structure of the building are still there. So I think it's important to take people to places where things happen. I don't know if you've been to Gettysburg or Chaco Canyon. When you go to a place, you have the sense, the feeling and association of the activities that went there. So things can be repurposed and reused, and also some things can be preserved in place. He talks about abandoned in place, and really that's when decommissioning happens and they don't have the money to demolish the site. They leave it there to fall apart. So we have many ways of preserving space heritage. We can look at photographs, videos, documents, and now we can do an archaeological investigation.
Well, I'd imagine that there has to be some type of conversation happening with people who are working in anthropology, archaeology, historians, and also the people who are on the ground right now, the engineers, the government agencies, and now the private companies who are into space exploration and space travel. So what type of conversation needs to be happening? Because it doesn't really seem like those two, the engineers and the historians are, they need to have a kind of a conversation, don't they, in order for this to be a reality?
Well, I think, say you were a career NASA engineer, you know how much blood, sweat, and tears you put into designing X, whatever it was, some part for the rocket. They can see the historical value of what they designed. I think also historians look at the documentation for our space history and what happened. And, it happened during the Cold War. It's part of the Cold War. We didn't just have battles on the ground in the Cold War. We had a battle in space, too. Also, with the commercial people that are going into space now. I was recently at Cape Canaveral to watch SpaceX successfully launch. So they are going to be in space and going back to the moon at some future time. So can we have an agreement about what's significant and what are the ways that we can preserve this so that future generations don't lose this information and don't lose the places that were critical at the time that they were created?
I mean, many of these places were obviously critical for various reasons. As you mentioned, there was a Cold War going on along the same time that the race to space was happening. So did that play some type of significant role that, a lot of these things were not being considered to be historical value because the United States, the USSR, was in such a frantic battle to get to outer space and see who could walk on the moon first and things like that?
Yeah, I think, it was such an intense time from about 58 when Sputnik was first launched. We were last, by the way. The Russians were successful in the first satellite, the first astronaut, and the first woman in space. But it was a battle in the Cold War, and we wanted to succeed. So I think with the Soviet Union and the US at that time, there wasn't a concern for preservation. It was like, get there, get the engineering done, get those guys up. And even Frank Borman, who lives here in Las Cruces, told me, he said, this voyage that they took to the moon for the first time was not a voyage of exploration. I was a military man. It was a voyage to help in the Cold War. So again, it has historic context, and those places and those artifacts and those sites provide information about that context.
Wow, it's really interesting to think about that and how quick the race happened. And now we're moving into this new era where we're talking about commercial space exploration and possibly commercial space travel here in the near future. So what are some of the things that, when we're shifting almost a focus of how we're getting to space, I guess through which type of now a private industry, are there some challenges that could be coming up to, possibly not preserving, or, I mean, what are the challenges that could get in the way of, continuing to preserve the further exploration into space?
Well, as I said, in 2011, when those guidelines, I was invited to help with the guidelines that NASA wrote. NASA created those because several of the competitors in the Google X Prize asked for guidance in going back to the moon. They haven't succeeded yet in going back to the moon, but those guidelines provide recommendations for how far away they should be when viewing the site, how they could create a boundary around the important sites on the moon, especially 11 and 17, the first and the last one. And then all our other assets, all our other artifacts and sites on the moon. We have robotics up there, we have different spacecraft, and the Russians also have very early, actually the first crash landings on the lunar surface. So it needs to be an international effort. That's the whole key. It really is humanity that did this. The brain power and the work that scientists and physicists and engineers and brave guys did really is humanity's heritage. It just happens to be that we got it from here, our home, out there.
Are we seeing more of a shift of that type of thinking? I mean, obviously it was a nationalistic type of thinking when space exploration first started in this country. Mm-hmm. Now we have the International Space Station, and we're coordinating with other countries. So, I mean, you talk a little bit about taking a more human perspective, mm-hmm. and thinking about preserving these artifacts in more of a, I guess, global perspective.
It's a cultural landscape. And who would think right now, if you want to go to the International Space Station, you personally, you have to buy a rocket ride from the Russians, okay? In 1969, that never would have happened. So it is global, and it is a cultural landscape where many nations came together. During Apollo, we had listening posts in Australia. We had telescopes in Great Britain. So humanity came together to try to help create and succeed these astronauts being put on the moon. So, I think when people realize that it's the brain power and the work and the efforts of a lot of different people in a lot of different countries that got us to the moon, and that hopefully in space it is a neutral landscape. It is a place not of warfare.
It seems though kind of difficult. I mean, especially when you look at this book and you see the up close pictures of some of the technology that was used, like the plug board or the launch control room. Uh-huh. It's really hard not to look at like you were looking at this completely different era of technology. I mean, how do you get past that?
You don't get past it, Anthony. Really, it is. Some of these look pretty hokey. They look like an old science fiction movie or something. That's what we started with. That's the amazing efforts that got made to get these guys to space, so that it looks clunky, it looks kind of old-fashioned. When they put Apollo up, 3/4 of all the world's semiconductors were in that project. Somebody had said to me one time, anecdotally, that the computing power in a greeting card, you open up and it plays happy birthday or something, that's more than the Apollo program had. Now, I'm not sure that's exactly true. That's probably an exaggeration. But again, we're watching our beginnings. We're watching the beginnings of this incredible exploration.
It seems like as we in New Mexico, especially here in southern New Mexico, continue to talk about space exploration, and we have, a spaceport that's built nearby mm-hmm. here that people can go and visit and take tours of, and the talk about that possibly being the launch pad for commercial space travel. I would think there's a whole nother field of possibly economic development for folks to really preserve a lot of these places that were the sites of the center of space exploration at one time.
Well, tourism is driven by visiting historic places. And of course, New Mexico, we have a lot from prehistoric to historic. And I think that capitalizing on the areas where space history happened and happened early on are really important. And that will invite people to come here to see the sites that were created at the time and to see the technology. So like the Museum of Space History in Alamogordo. You know, it allows people to see a V2 rocket up close and personal. And I think we're going to go back into space. I don't know if I certainly can't afford the price tag now, but I think in the future we will go back to space. And we have lost a lot of our heritage here on Earth, and I hope that we don't lose it on the moon.
I mean, it seems like a lot of it happens so quick. I mean, we're talking about just decades ago. If you go to some of these sites, I mean, it looks as if it was, you know, you're going to, you know, something 200 years ago, the way that it
or
looks.
2,000 years ago. When I was there at Launch Complex 34 in Cape Canaveral, which
that was the launch pad of, was it the first Apollo?
Yes, and that's on that front cover of the book. You know, there's nothing else there except these 3 gigantic concrete pillars. It is also where the Apollo 1 astronauts lost their lives during a test. There's a simple bench with their names on the bench. And so it's a memorial to bravery and a memorial to heroic acts. And it gives you this sense of how creative and strong and brave and almost against all odds, people created something that got us off the Earth for the first time. So I think these places and preserving these places is very important to our reflections on who we are as humans.
Wow. I mean, when you say that, I mean, it just really hits hits hard, because I mean, it's a deep thing. I mean, you think of it more as a human race experience.
Yes.
Than you do as, you know, somebody in the United States or in Russia or in
What's
China
your first
today.
memory of space?
I think of I think of obviously the moon, but I also think of, you know, the shuttle. I think of the Challenger.
Tragedy.
The tragedy in the Challenger in 1984. I mean, that's something that I think or it could be 86. I don't know if I'm right off the year, but it's I remember that moment, you know, and we remember the tragedies, but I guess it also brings to light the bravery that is involved that you mentioned.
Yes, and the risks of going to space, and those people that were on the 2 shuttles that tragically ended in coming out of space. So I think that we have to understand that humanity explored all the world. They went to every continent. They've gone deep into the ocean, and now they've gone off the Earth into space. So that heroicism and that feeling that there are no limits, you know, it's a big universe. I don't even have a concept of how big the universe is, but we have little symbolic artifacts out there.
We do have different perspectives of space travel, though. I mean, you asked me what I thought, and obviously you have your moments of what you thought, but I'm curious, though, like growing up, when you were thinking about space travel, how did it dominate the news in the media, and how was it talked about on a daily basis?
Well, I was a student in Norway in high school when they landed on the moon, and I remember watching a little tiny black and white TV and watching those guys come down, everybody speaking Norwegian around me, which I didn't speak, and I heard the Eagle has landed in that deep Texas accent, and I was very proud of my country. But I also was very afraid, because I knew that, you know, this race to the moon and the first satellites and the missiles that were being tested were dangerous. And I think there was a feeling of fear when I was growing up. I had a colleague that was from Siberia about my same age, and I met her, and we talked about this, and she said, we were very afraid when these early flights were going on and these missile tests were going on. We thought the Americans would come over and crush Russia. So the world was fearful in the beginning of the space age. And I think more and more as the astronauts became heroic, they were adopted by many, many people. By the way, when Neil Armstrong died recently, I think people realized that now this is a historic age. You know, it almost is like his passing at 80-some years of age signaled a moment when we've gone from the recent past to the regular past.
That's an interesting way to think about it. When you look through this book and think about the work that you put into it, what are some of the thoughts that you have and some of the thoughts that you hope people really take away from it?
Well, I hope it excites more students. I'm not teaching anymore, but I'm still sitting on a few committees, and I hope people, young people especially, are still entranced by space, because during the 50s and 60s it was a renaissance of math and science and people getting into those two subjects in engineering. So I hope it inspires people. I hope it makes people become advocates for space heritage preservation when they have something local in their area, whether it's New Mexico or Hawaii or California, that they say, yeah, this is an important part of our history. We need to preserve it. And that has happened. We have had a lot of grassroots preservation efforts for space. So I hope it inspires people and it allows them to look at all the work and all the details and all the amazing successes, as well as some of the terrible tragedies that happened when people took the risk of getting us off the Earth.
Wow. I mean, well, first of all, I wanted to say thank you very much for being here and sharing all your work that you've done with this book. And it's really interesting to think about just that history and all the work that's gone into the space exploration, not only in our country, but the world. Thank you very much. We want to thank you for joining us. I'm Anthony Moreno. This is Fronteras, a Changing America.